TTRA audience, thank you so much for being here today. It is absolutely our pleasure to be presenting this research and honestly this story because it is a very powerful one. So here we are, getting ahead of crisis on November 2022. As Mike said, my name is David Reichbach. I'm the Senior Director of Analytics and Data Security for Destination Analysts. For any of you who don't know, Destination Analysts is a full-service market research firm. We do all different types of research, but we specialize in the travel and tourism space, providing independent and unbiased research to our over 200 destination brands and their agency partners. I am very honored today to be joined by Alisha Valentine with Discover Puerto Rico. Our goal for today's presentation is to share how research is necessary to support a destination in a time of crisis. As many of you know, Hurricane Fiona touched down on the island of Puerto Rico on September 17th of this year. Today, Alisha and I are going to walk you through all of the data points, information, and insights that Alisha and her team had at their fingertips in that moment, and how having that information in that time of crisis led to strategy, led to specific action for Discover Puerto Rico, and ultimately led to some short-term and long-term successes as that leads into recovery. To give you a highlight of all of the different data points that Alisha and her team had, I'm going to give an overview of Discover Puerto Rico's research program. Full disclosure, Discover Puerto Rico uses more than just Destination Analysts to build out their research program, and Destination Analysts definitely encourages getting data points from lots of different sources and vendors, because that's how we get the best information is to work together and triangulate in a way. But I'm going to be mainly focusing on the research that Destination Analysts has the privilege of helping Discover Puerto Rico with and putting it together. So in that time of crisis, there are a couple different questions that you have, right? The moment the hurricane touches down, we start with questions about on-island behavior. Is it actually impacting on-island behavior? Are visitors experiencing things differently now or in the moments right after the hurricane touchdown? So for that, we look to their ongoing visitor profile, which includes in-person intercepts on the island. We also look to their online visitor profile panel collection that we have going. We also look at their mobile geolocation data, which we've been analyzing for Discover Puerto Rico for a while now, using data from NEAR and getting some really interesting insights that might lead to great direction. On the other side of it, the sentiment and perceptions, off-island impacts of the hurricane touching down, the big questions are, do people even know that the hurricane touched down? What are their perceptions of that? Do they think the entire island was destroyed? And do they really understand how the hurricane has impacted their sentiment and perceptions about visiting? So for that, we'll turn to our national sentiment tracker, our State of the American Traveler, that gets fielded monthly amongst American travelers, of which we track interest and likelihood to visit Puerto Rico every month. We also have specific hurricane impact research that we put into the field in response to Hurricane Fiona that Alisha will walk through in a lot more detail. On the sort of brand ad effectiveness side, because of the response to the hurricane impact, we did some creative testing to understand whether what the creative messaging needed to be to really respond to the hurricane in a positive way. We can also do some conversion and ROI on that eventually at a later date. And of course, qualitative assessments, because we're have been working on a number of different projects for Discover Puerto Rico using focus groups and in-depth interviews with travelers, and we were able to utilize some of those resources to help inform their response to the hurricane and ultimate marketing strategy. So I'm going to start with the National Sentiment Tracker, our State of the American Traveler study. The data I'm going to be showing today was in the field the 10-day period, September 15th through the 25th. And remember, Hurricane Fiona touched down on September 17th. So we just happened to be in the field collecting this data in that moment of crisis. And we're able to sort of put our finger on the pulse of American sentiment around some of these natural disaster feelings in that moment. I want to start with data from our State of the American Traveler study on likelihood to visit Puerto Rico over time. And this is just looking at year to date from January through September when I pulled the data for this study. The orange line on screen represents the proportion of American travelers that say they're likely to visit Puerto Rico in the future. The blue line represents the proportion of American travelers that say they have visited Puerto Rico in the past. And you'll notice from August to September, that orange line does dip down a little bit. That drop from August to September could be an impact of Hurricane Fiona, either in the media, could be awareness, could be word of mouth. I want to point out, though, that that drop from August to September doesn't drop further below where likelihood to visit had been in May, April, March, going backward, just earlier this year by a couple months. So although that might be an impact from the hurricane, I, number one, can't say that that is exactly what is causing that drop, and number two, absolutely does not look like it's dropping so far below where we would expect it to be at this time of year anyway. In our September collection for State of the American Traveler, we were already asking questions about the impact of natural disasters on travel, and we were specifically focused on wildfire impacts because I'm based in the state of California, and the western region of the United States has had a lot of wildfire in the news that has absolutely been impacting the way American travelers had been feeling about travel. So we had already had a question set fielding at the time the hurricane hit that really generated some interesting insights that I'll walk you through. 11% of American travelers in September of this year said that natural events, hazards, or disasters have impacted their travel planning in some way. If we subset or segment just to the proportion of American travelers that on that previous slide said that they were likely to visit Puerto Rico, that jumps up just a little bit to 13.9%. Not a huge increase, but it's important to know that that audience might be a little more sensitive to natural disasters in their impacting their travel planning. Of that, 11% of American travelers who said that natural disasters do impact them in some way, we asked what kinds of natural disasters are really impacting the way you plan travel. Top of this list is wildfires, followed by heat waves, floods, winter storms at about a quarter, and only 1 in 5 of those American travelers said hurricanes or tropical storms are really impacting their travel planning. Again, if we look at just the subset that said they were likely to visit Puerto Rico, and that jumps up to 31.8%. So again, that audience, the audience specific and most valuable to Discover Puerto Rico, might be a little more sensitive than the average traveler in terms of whether hurricanes and tropical storms are going to impact them. But remember that this is 31% of that 13%. So it ends up being about 3 or 4% overall of all American travelers. It's not the huge majority that you might otherwise consider it to be. When we ask about how natural disasters are impacting their travel planning, over a third, 37%, said it just made them change the timing of a trip they were planning. So they delayed a trip and maybe perhaps to a later month. 1 in 5 said that they avoided a specific destination. So they probably took the trip they were planning, but changed where they were going. And then 17% canceled the trip outright. We ask just because we wanted to make sure that whether there were differences between those who had canceled and those who had changed destinations, what types of natural disasters most commonly caused a full trip cancellation. Top of the list is wildfires by a large margin. Only 17.8% of those travelers who had canceled a trip outright said that it was because of a hurricane or tropical storm. And the wildfires being at the top of that list strongly correlates to the western region of the United States, California and Oregon, being the most common destinations that a trip had been canceled. Similar question, but looking at the respondents who said that natural disasters cause them to avoid a destination. Again, wildfires cause the list by a slightly smaller margin, but still in the lead ahead of floods and heat waves. Again, only 12% of these travelers saying that they avoided a destination due to a hurricane or tropical storm. And again, California and Oregon top the list of the destinations that American travelers are most commonly avoiding, again, due to those wildfires. This was a map which in September was a current snapshot of natural disaster reporting across the country. There is a lot of it that was happening this year. I don't know if all of this had actually been in the news, but it was pretty significant. And as you can see, the western region of the United States, specifically California and Oregon and Washington, lots of wildfires that were happening at this time. So that was kind of the impetus of this entire question set. We asked all American travelers, were you aware of the major wildfires that were happening throughout throughout that month, that set of months? 82.8%. So the majority of American travelers were aware that wildfires were happening before taking the survey. However, only 1 in 5, 20.2%, said that the wildfires actually had impacted their travel planning. And again, the impacts from that 20%, 39% said that they avoided a specific destination, 30% researched the ongoing wildfires to make sure their trip wouldn't be impacted. Only 1 in 5, 19%, said that they changed the timing of a trip, and only 12% actually canceled outright. We asked all American travelers whether, in sort of an ongoing way, whether natural disasters are part of their consideration process when they're planning travel. And currently, 14.5% of American travelers overall say that they consider the possibility of natural disasters either always or often. The majority, even though it's only a slight majority, 55.6% say only sometimes, and 29% never consider it at all. When we ask American travelers about the sources of information they rely on when thinking about natural disasters when planning travel, 54.9% said they rely on news stories or commentary, 29.8% word of mouth, friends or family talking about it, another 29% their own personal experience, and 23% posts on social media. When we review or segment this out by generation, unsurprisingly, the news, stories, and commentary, although they are the largest for all generations, boomers definitely lead the use of news stories and commentary. When it comes to the word of mouth, relying on word of mouth or relying on social media, Gen Z definitely leads the other generations in that resource reliance. So that kind of summarizes the national perspective that Alisha and her team had at their fingertips when the hurricane hit. Now we're going to dive into specific data that Alisha and her team had as part of their ongoing research program. And I'm going to start with answering questions from the data on on-island behavior using both location data and their visitor profile data. Right now, what we're looking at on screen is location data by day, and it's specific device trip end dates that I'm charting here. I very rarely recommend any of the destinations that we analyze location data. I very rarely recommend that we look at data by day. Day to day, just because of the way information can be collected, might have variances that don't have an explanation. But with consistent collection of data, there should be consistent patterns seen in that data. And so if we look at just kind of the trends on this chart without diving into exactly what's causing those trends, you can see in June that kind of like a heartbeat, the number of trips each day goes up and then drops. You can see in July that same kind of trend goes up and then drops. You can see in August that same kind of trend goes up and then drops. And in September, we did not see that same pattern. And actually, on the date of the hurricane, September 17th, we see a huge spike. And again, you're probably wondering, why is there a huge spike in location data traffic on the date the hurricane hit? It is charting end dates, trip end dates. So basically, when the hurricane hit, a really large amount of travelers left the island, and that's what we're seeing in the day-to-day. Again, I very rarely recommend looking at day-to-day location data. I think monthly trends sometimes tell a really comprehensive story in that way. But it was really interesting to see that even in that sort of microeconomic view, there are insights that we can pull out of it and measurements that potentially can lead to great strategy. Looking at some monthly trends, though, we pulled data from two top attractions, visitor attractions on the island of Puerto Rico. One is the Distrito T-Mobile um, area, which is right in the San Juan metro area, and the other is the El Yunque National Forest. And just looking at sort of the trend line from August to September for both of these, we see that for Distrito T-Mobile, huge increase on that orange sort of trend line in terms of number of devices seen in that location compared to the El Yunque National Forest. August to September showed a drop that we otherwise may not have expected at that time.
David, if you don't mind, I'll jump in on these. Certainly, the El Yunque National Forest experienced landslides during the hurricane, so they did have to close a portion of the rainforest in order to accommodate the Fiona destruction. And the Distrito T-Mobile is in our convention district, which encouragingly we had a lot of groups scheduled for September because it is typically hurricane season. That's a great time for groups to get lower rates. And we didn't see them canceling. So even after Fiona, we still had those groups come in, but especially that convention district was kind of the rallying point for recovery efforts. So FEMA was sending folks into this area in order for them to get their assignments and go out into the island. So it really makes a lot of sense to us looking at this data, why we'd see those in these two particular attractions.
That is really fascinating and honestly really, really encouraging. Thank you for sharing that. That's hugely powerful. Turning to the visitor experience, we know from the ongoing visitor profile that we conduct for Discover Puerto Rico that a couple of among the top reasons why visitors select Puerto Rico as a place to visit is weather. We know that weather is going to be impacting their destination selection, and so knowing that absolutely helps us focus in on whether or not Hurricane Fiona is impacting any of those destination selection factors. We know from travelers that we've talked to on the island that sort of in an unopened or unaided way, the feelings that they have evoked have been hugely satisfying, happy, and positive. We know that visitors to Puerto Rico have given us some of the highest rates of satisfaction, likelihood to return, and likelihood to recommend that we see for any destination that we track this information for. And then, of course, specifically focusing on in-destination issues, only 13% of visitors at this time said that they had any issues in destination. 49% of that 13% said concerns about crime and safety. But I do not believe that the safety there actually encompasses any kind of hurricane awareness or safety, although there was some collection in September on island. I really don't think we're going to see the impacts of Hurricane Fiona until we get a look at the October data, October and November, which hasn't actually fully been collecting and coming in yet. So wait to see on that in terms of whether the visitor experience on island is really being impacted by any of these issues. At this point, I will turn it over to Alisha to jump into the specific Hurricane Fiona tracker research that we did among some other data points. Alisha, go ahead.
Thank you, David. So our work with Destination Analysts has really enabled us to be able to respond quickly, and our volume and spending really speaks to that. In 2021, tourism economics showed that we had the highest non-resident visitor spending ever and the most lodging taxes collected, even coming out of the pandemic. So we were on track to do that again. And of course, that's now threatened with Hurricane Fiona hitting. But unfortunately, this is not Puerto Rico's first rodeo with crisis. So while Discover Puerto Rico as a DMO wasn't created until after Hurricane Maria in 2017, we were certainly dealing with the aftermath of the image of devastation when a series of earthquakes hit in January of 2020. If only that had been the biggest challenge of that year. But because we had been able to feel this consumer perception piece so quickly, we were able to understand how this compared to those earthquakes of 2020. And on the left, we'll see here that we really were able to understand that while consumers didn't think we were ready for visitors the same week Fiona made landfall, that we were able to start fielding with destination analysts, but there was certainly more confidence that the island would soon reopen and be ready for visitors. That after that series of earthquakes, that perception post Maria still lingered so much that even then consumers did not think that we would be ready soon to welcome more visitors. But on the right, we knew that we were really dealing with a media fueled problem. And though the damage of Hurricane Fiona was fairly limited to the south and western parts of the island, this was not clear given the media coverage that we were going just through yet another hurricane. And the perception was that Puerto Rico was receiving the same kind of damage that we had post Hurricane Maria 5 years earlier. So, though we were able to, sorry, the remote control here, because we were able to understand how consumers were responding in their planning process, we saw that we were surveying a national audience, and that we saw 83% of travelers aware of this landfall, and so much so of that being really media fueled, and that coverage being so strong, especially because then 10 days after Fiona, Ian hit Florida. So it just really kept Puerto Rico and the impact of Fiona on travelers' radar probably longer than it would have otherwise. But it was encouraging to us that those that had travel intentions, both within 6 months and within a year, weren't planning any changes, just as David's data regarding national sentiment and responding to weather events, that for the most part, consumers were continuing with travel as planned. Certainly, we were seeing some consumers make decisions to move that timing of the trip, but for the most part, they weren't necessarily changing their destination. It was just altering the plans that were already in place. But we know that consumers were really unsure of the scope of the damage. And so we were seeing that even the consumers were making lots of assumptions about what the path of a hurricane might look like. They assume that it comes through the eastern part of the island and sweeps across, when that wasn't really the case. It was the south and the west that received actual landfall and had severe damage. And the consumer perception was it was really in the east. And so we knew we had work to do here. But it was not only the areas that were impacted, but also the types of impacts. So certainly the power grid in Puerto Rico is fairly fragile, and most of the island was without power in the initial days following Fiona. But again, consumers were making lots of assumptions about other types of impacts. They assumed that there were road closures, that the airport was closed, that hotels were closed when flights were up and running the next day. And so much of the industry really learned from Hurricane Maria and was able to invest in that infrastructure and the hotel properties, especially having generators on site, that the visitor experience for those that were there. Obviously, David showed us, so many were actually departing the day before and day of Fiona, that those that remained, the experience really was unchanged for most of those that were staying in the San Juan area, because it is in the north. And yes, they received, some days of heavy rain, but in terms of experiencing hurricane like winds, that just wasn't their experience. Our hotels actually end up seeing higher occupancy following these kinds of events, because we have FEMA coming in with first responders, because even residents then turn to these kinds of properties that have generators when maybe they don't in their own homes. But again, we knew we had work to do in order to educate consumers about what those real impacts were because of this data. And some of those things that we were able to put into place were really focused on showing consumers real-time views of what the island looked like. We really wanted to show current timestamps of, what the beaches look like, that, it's not, torn up and strewn with, debris, that these are, time-stamped and have location of what these images were showing these consumers. But we just happened to be in the middle of some other research with Destination Analysts, actually talking to both African American and Hispanic and Puerto Rican diaspora as part of our DE&I research. And we're in qualitative sessions with them already, and had the opportunity to then take this kind of creative to them and understand, is this really what they needed to see? Yes, we were showing them kind of our brand campaign at the same time, but we knew we had to acknowledge this situation that had happened just a week prior to these in-person groups. So we've got some images from what those groups look like.
Yeah, and just as a little bit of a setup to the video before we play it, um, it is a recording of a recording, so forgive a little bit of the kind of cutting of it in the beginning. If we had known that we were going to be showing this story, we would have recorded it in a different way. But in the focus group, our team had shown, as Alisha said, a video of their brand campaign and gotten feedback on it, and then showed them this video that you're about to see, and you're actually going to get to see them react to it after the fact. And I really want you to listen to the specific words they use when after they've seen this video, because it impacts them in a really powerful way.
Here's the truth about the people of Puerto Rico. Here's the truth about Boricuas. Nothing can stop our spirit.
Nothing will keep us from sharing the home that we love.
Your visit means as much to us as it means to you. Our airports are open. Our restaurants are open. Our accommodations are open.
Our streets are open.
And as always,
Our arms are open too.
we are Boricuas.
All right. So I'm curious, watching that second video, which is more focused on obviously the recent natural disaster that occurred in Puerto Rico, and how does that make you feel about visiting?
It's funny because earlier when you asked the group the other question, that's the kind of messaging I was looking for, like something that actually addresses what happened. Because it feels wrong. Like people over here mourning family members with no water, no heat, no electricity, and you're here on a vacation. No, it feels inappropriate. So to hear that Puerto Rico is open and that maybe help us rebuild, come spend here to spur the local economy, to hear that kind of messaging is reassuring. And almost it feels like a call to action of sorts. Okay, I'll go to Puerto Rico to help rebuild. It doesn't hurt to have a couple beers on the side,
But I love how positive and upbeat they were about it. It was very sincere, very genuine. So I did like it. I like the way that it came across. So it might sway my decision a little bit more after seeing this.
Would appreciate the message that they're open. They're letting you know that everything is okay. So yeah, I would want to go, and especially
don't get distracted by the storms and still come and visit.
Having a reason to visit there, you can choose to go anywhere, but they are open, and it is a reassuring message, and that's really good to hear. It definitely reassures me about my upcoming trip in a couple weeks, that people are feeling good about visitors coming. And of course, the reminder that after a hurricane, they probably do need the support of the local tourism economy more than ever. And so a natural disaster shouldn't be a reason to deter you from going somewhere. I think it's a good message.
So just to kind of recap some of the really like gems that came out of this group, and as Alisha said, this group was not originally pulled together to talk about this campaign and their reactions to it, but it was a really authentic and genuine reaction. They said, it's really good that they're addressing what happened. They're reassuring. It's the kind of messaging I was looking for. It's a call to action, and it's sincere and genuine. So really, really powerful reactions, and exactly what Discover Puerto Rico's team needed to hear in order to know that this messaging and marketing plan was hitting the right tone to go to market.
So for those of you that might not be familiar, the tagline there was "We are Boricua," and our actual brand campaign is "Live Boricua." And Boricua is a term that Puerto Ricans use to identify themselves. It comes from their Taino Indian heritage, and I like to explain it as I'm from Indiana, where we call ourselves Hoosiers, where there's no real definition for that term on its own. It's just a collection of people. And so that is what Boricua is for Puerto Rico as well. So hopefully, I think that's probably a campaign that many of you have seen in other ways throughout the conference circuit. But this wasn't just a one and done process for us in getting us to understand how to respond creatively. Really, we conducted the same survey process 2 weeks later and then 4 weeks later, really understanding how we were able to move that needle in terms of, was this messaging cutting through? And you can see, even though that East region wasn't impacted, it certainly was able to move the right direction in terms of consumers understanding it really wasn't that area of the island. And that area of the island is so important to us because it is really where there is a lot of product. And that is where we have our bioluminescent bay. Actually, 2 of the 3 of them that are in Puerto Rico are on that eastern part of the island. And so for consumers to understand that is not the area that is impacted was especially important. And that's also where that El Yunque rainforest is, that yes, they experienced landslides, but whenever they were able to clear the roads from that it was open and ready to welcome visitors again. So again, just as we wanted to understand that consumers were getting the message of the kinds of impacts, the areas impacted, the types of impacts. Yes, there's no getting around that there were power outages, and that the island continued to have issues, even a week later. And certainly, again, seeing the declines in understanding that flights weren't canceled because of this hurricane impact, that there weren't hotel closures because of this. We started seeing things really moving in the right direction. And the idea of why they're not considering Puerto Rico, certainly that first week, the week of the hurricane, seeing a third of consumers saying, nope, we're not interested. We won't even consider Puerto Rico because of these issues. Certainly just encouraged in 2 weeks later to see such a decline there. And again, Puerto Rico is just primarily not on consumers' radar as a travel destination, and seeing that, really that's the primary education of brand campaign needing to be out there, and not necessarily hurricane impact messaging, that consumers really just needed a minute. They needed that to take that beat to understand what the impacts were and how widespread it was, to really say, okay, this is not necessarily what I thought it was based off of what I was seeing in the media in those first days. And we really saw that in terms of understanding the appeal of the destination. We worked with destination analysts even prior to this immediate impact research that we needed in evaluating some of our advertising and marketing placements in 2021 and early 2022. And we had seen, after investing pretty significant resources over the course of the previous 18 months, primarily because the federal government had finally released the funds that were allocated by Congress from Hurricane Maria in 2017 were finally released under the new administration in January of 2021. And then at the same time, those funds were becoming available. Of course, the post-pandemic funds from both the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. So we had significant marketing dollars that had been invested at that end point, really, in March of 2022, where we saw that high in appeal. So yes, we saw that immediate dip that first week post Fiona, but then have now started to see that rebound. And we're seeing this also in our actual booking data. As we were able to evaluate what's happening pre-Fiona, our hotels were booking about 15% above 2021, the week before Fiona hit. And that just continued to fall week over week, but really hit its low point about 4 weeks out, and then has now started to return. And our Q1, again, we've been in a very lucky position in terms of, just how the destination is positioned coming out of the pandemic as a U.S. destination that, had the type of product that consumers were looking for, and it was very easy to travel to us when many international destinations were, had other hoops to jump through. So all of these components have really enabled us to build a targeted campaign. And specifically, some of the pieces that David mentioned regarding the geolocation data and the visitor profile data, we have been able to bring forth a plan to the governor's office to really target lifting up that south and west region that were most impacted. We're able to really target consumers that typically travel to those regions based off of that geolocation data. We're able to understand the kinds of products that consumers are looking for whenever they're traveling to those regions. So now, we put forth to the governor a plan that we estimated would need about $2.5 million of investment. And he said, well, how about 5? So that we're able to have the data behind the pieces that we're putting into place and have the confidence of the leadership. Really, you have to have this kind of information to make those work. So David, it looks like we do have a question from Scott. So this is specifically surrounding what we're seeing in terms of the power grid. So I don't know that others can see the questions here, but our continuing problems with the power grid is certainly part of the media conversation at this point. That yes, the dollars that were allocated post-Maria were finally released in January of 21. But now, being able to actually see changes in the grid, it's not coming together as would be expected. Again, it is that the industry has been able to respond separately from the government in not relying on what that looks like in terms of power generation, and just ensuring that they're able to service customers. And absolutely continue to see, power problems in our survey data. It's a piece we obviously have to be transparent about because the media is covering it anyway. So, so a piece that, as a DMO, we certainly have no control over, but we just need to ensure that consumers have the messaging that our product is ready to serve them and able to accommodate if there are issues.
And Alisha, that kind of answers the first question that came in through the Q&A box also, but just in case, the question was, in addition to getting facts out after the incident, does Discover Puerto Rico include focus on preparedness and infrastructure improvements in its general marketing? So better information is available to potential travelers before hurricane seasons.
So certainly consumers aren't choosing Puerto Rico because of problems in these areas. So we focus 100% on why they are choosing us and what that differentiator is. And we think, again, Boricua, that culture, the people, and that connection. And it is not something that we, put first and foremost in our marketing. That piece that David shared that we, put out immediately post hurricane, that only ran for, a 2 or 3 week period. That was a hurricane response piece that was not the kind of messaging that we would typically put out, but what consumers needed to hear at that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to kind of underscore that, as we know from measuring how travelers get inspired across the nation, across the globe, and why they make the travel decisions they do, and what drives their motivations. Knowing that a place is open and safe is absolutely a threshold issue, right? If there are immediate questions on can I go, or will I be safe, or will I be welcomed, that's absolutely immediate messaging need that we've seen for many destinations. This is not unique to Discover Puerto Rico at all. But the sort of ongoing, if there isn't an immediate threat there, the ongoing messaging really should be about the passion, about the people, about the real drivers and the inspiration. Those are at the brand level. There's nothing more powerful. So yeah, can't underscore what Alisha was sharing enough. The second question is, how do you use geolocation data to gauge visitation during off-peak season? I can answer from the sort of data perspective that we're analyzing their location data, and just so that we're clear, we define the location data set that we're using to help Discover Puerto Rico dig into this data as device trips that sort of enter and leave the island with specific parameters that we are very careful to clean out. We're trying to make sure that we understand that visitors have to engage in certain behaviors to know that we can trust that data and really dig into it and give it a lot of power over marketing decisions. So there's a lot of work that goes into that in terms of the analysis side, but we're looking at data all year long, not just in the peak seasons. We're absolutely understanding and trying to measure whether visitor origin markets change seasonally, whether visitor behaviors on island change seasonally, whether beaches or the rainforest or specific sets of hotels or even just specific regions around the island are more or less likely to be visited at different times of the year. We kind of analyze all of those different variables, and it all just really comes down to how Alisha and her team want to use it. Alisha, anything you want to add in terms of how you use location data during off-peak season?
Absolutely. So certainly, as David mentioned, understanding for us that that low period is August through October because it is hurricane season, and what those origin markets are certainly. But outside of the geolocation data, typically rates are lower during that period. So we're seeing more value-driven travelers during that time. So how can we, shift that messaging to not only the markets that are coming during that period, but also consumers who are more value driven during that time than would otherwise be throughout the course of the year.
Awesome. If there are any other questions from the audience, please type them in now. I'll just, while we're waiting for that, just take the time to say thank you for everyone who tuned in today. It is an absolute honor and privilege for Destination Analysts to be one of Discover Puerto Rico's research partners. And I want to point out that you may have heard during our presentation, and Alisha and I both used this phrase, we just happened. We just happened to be in the field with State of the American Traveler when the hurricane hit. We just happened to be doing a focus group when we needed to test this piece of creative. It's really important to put out there that really good research and well planned out research programs don't just happen. It's really due to the amazing partnership that we have with Discover Puerto Rico, that they put the investment into having research available so that when, God forbid, a crisis happens, we're ready to react and be agile and be flexible as an industry and not just as an organization. So yeah, I hope you guys all took that away today, and thank you for the opportunity to share.